It's day 444. It's also July 23rd, 2020. And we are in Craig, Montana.
You ever wake up in the morning and ask yourself, what am I doing? And more importantly, why? Yeah, me too. Hi, my name's Craig, and this is my story. A story about life. Life out there. For visuals while listening, search Life Out There on your favorite social media platform or use the links in the podcast description.
Craig, Montana. Finally. I've been itching to get back here ever since we drove through last year. I've talked in previous episodes about my fascination with towns that have my name, but Craig, Montana is different. I not only share its name, it is quite literally my name. Warren and Eliza Craig, pioneers and prospectors. They traveled from Peoria, Illinois to file a gold claim in Montana in 1886. They'd build a log cabin on the site that would become Craig. As the community grew, the couple would become key players in the establishment of the town while raising their 7 children. They are also my great-great-grandparents. Now, my first memories of Craig, Montana, even coming up in conversation, were in the late summer of 1977. It had been a tough year. My mom's second marriage was ending. California was still recovering from gas shortages and a drought. Elvis had just died. And as if to add insult to injury, my grandparents had decided that California was not the place to be, and we were moving back to the quote-unquote homeland, with my brother, my mom, and myself in tow. Now the details of how exactly we skipped over the homeland and ended up in a place called North Branch, Minnesota, well, those were details apparently not shared with a sulky teenager who thought the idea in general was the most absurd thing his young mind had ever been forced to contemplate. So absurd, in fact, that this sulky teenager would go so far as to plot to run away from home in protest. Now, needless to say, the protest failed, and I'm pretty sure now that everyone knew I was camped out in the crawl space below the house for the whole 3 days. In the end, this angst-filled teenager was dragged off kicking and screaming, pouting, the entire way to what I would begin referring to as the frozen wasteland. But in the midst of all this angst and anger, there was one bright spot in that summer. It was the time we spent in Helena, Montana. This is when I first saw and heard, or maybe just the first time I actually listened to what adults around me were saying about a place, a cabin. And even if unknowingly, I began committing to memory names of places like Helena and Wolf Creek and Cascade and Boulder and Great Falls, and yes, Craig. Then there was that hot afternoon when I went with Grandpa for a drive up to the cabin. As cliché as it sounds, that afternoon was forever imprinted in my head. And I'm not even sure why, then, or even all these years later. But it was as clear today as it was that day that this place, it meant something. And in the mind of a 13-year-old, things are bigger. It's well documented that juveniles are experts at burying the important stuff like where they actually are, or how we got there, or why we're even there, and replacing them with things like keep an eye out for bear, or stay out of the grass behind the root cellar. Rattlers like it back there. This California kid didn't even really know what a bear or a rattler was. but both sounded pretty adventurous and new, and maybe even a little dangerous. So, look out? Yeah, I did. I remember standing in front of what Grandpa would call a root cellar. And even though he told me twice what it was, I don't think I grasped the concept, or believed him even. I remember thinking, you guys used to put food in a hole in the ground for consumption later? Pretty sure I chalked the concept up to the notion that the adults in my life had completely taken leave of their senses. But mostly, I remember standing in front of this cabin, gazing at the detail as Grandpa explained to me how Grandma Johnson and Grandpa Gus had built it, log by log. And later on, they'd save enough money to have plumbing brought indoors. As if outdoor plumbing was an option, I thought. But yet, there was that building over there, indicating that perhaps outdoor plumbing was once the only option. The screened-in porch held the wringer washer and a rocking chair. And I imagined sitting on that porch, protected from the mosquitoes from that river at the bottom of the mountain, and those pesky rattlers he kept telling me about. And nearly 40 years later, I'm here in Craig. I don't have the benefit of the knowledge my grandfather could have provided, so I'll do what I can to find things on my own. At this point, I have no way of knowing if I'll ever see that cabin again. But I know that this place is more than connected to me. I feel like it is me, and I just wanted to know why. We arrived in Craig midday. I immediately started wandering, exploring, maybe even trying to channel my grandfather a little. After all, how hard could it be to find a cabin in the woods in the heart of Montana? Turns out, it's about as hard as you might think. Throw in the private drive and keep out signs, and it quickly became obvious that in the land of cabins, I had unknowingly embarked on a search for the proverbial needle in the haystack. But then, day 2 in Craig? After a certain series of events, I realized I've given up on trying to understand why we are where we are at certain times. There's just no explaining or understanding. It's just meant to be, so you gotta go with it. A day that started with wandering down a dirt road out of Craig called Craig River Road led us to nothing but more dirt road and endless farmland and mountains with the Missouri River always just below us. But this day would become so much more. Most everything that's not a main road these days, of which there are many, are marked private property, making one wonder how many times I might have driven past the very road that went to that cabin. And then, about 15 miles out on Craig River Road, I came out on a highway and took a right. And a few miles in, I could feel that I was driving away from Craig. So when I saw a dirt road with the name 7 Mile Road, I made that right-hand turn. A long and slow 7-mile drive through ranches and hayfields ended when we rounded a bend and I was faced with a weathered old sign that read, Craig Cemetery. Suddenly I was flooded with a weird range of emotion as I passed under the sign. On one hand, I thought, why didn't I think of that? The cemetery could hold a great deal of information. On the other hand, I thought, weird that I would just randomly end up here. I also contemplated the irony in it all, driving into a place that most consider the end, for me, could likely be the beginning. I parked and started walking up and down the rows of the carefully maintained grounds. Nearing the front row, I stepped out to the point where I could see the entire town of Craig, Montana, population 43, sitting quietly on the banks of the Missouri below us. Pretty awesome. I snapped a couple photos, and then I turned around to start back up another row, but I'd lost track of where I had left off. So I backtracked a little, and then I saw her. The stone read, Nellie Craig Johnson. It was all suddenly coming back to me. I did indeed know her name all this time, so why could I only remember Grandma Johnson? Nonetheless, there they were, Nellie and Gus Johnson, side by side, in the front row with this beautiful view of the town they'd helped to build. I gazed upon the rows above them, where there were 3 more generations of the Craig name. I captured names and dates and was suddenly obsessed with learning about these people that I had never met. Yet were it not for them, I would not be standing here in this very moment. As I backed up a bit and started to turn, I looked at a beautiful granite stone, etched with the name Spry. Below it read, Kenneth Craig and Esther Irene. I couldn't believe it. I'd been standing right next to my grandma and grandpa this whole time. And next to them, my grandfather's brother, Clifford, and my Aunt Marilyn. And it suddenly hit me that with my presence here on this day, there were 6 generations of the Craig name in Craig, Montana. I felt pretty dang proud and even more humble in that moment. I sat down next to Grandma and Grandpa. I told them how good it was to see them, how good it felt to be back in Craig. I spent an awesome afternoon on that mountain above Craig, Montana, just absorbing. As I left, I patted Grandma and Grandpa on the headstone, pun intended, and promised I'd visit again before I left. And at that moment I randomly wondered, if I left? It was then that I read the last line on their granite stone. It said that this monument had been placed here to commemorate their time here on Earth, while their ashes were set free on the Beartooth Ranch, where Kenneth worked as a young man. Beartooth Ranch? I thought. I got that tingly feeling all over as I wondered, could it possibly be that there was a correlation between that ranch and the Beartooth Wildlife Management Area that I had just spent the previous night on? As soon as I got back to the RV park at the bottom of the mountain, I asked the camp host if he knew where the Beartooth Ranch was. His response? That about 30,000 acres of that ranch had been sold to a wildlife management area that now bore its name. He went on to explain that the ranch was originally named for the Beartooth Mountains that it sat at the base of. It suddenly became clear that I had spent more time with Grandma and Grandpa than I had even known over the past couple of days. I had also not only just camped near their final resting place, I'd also walked with Dougie in the very footsteps of my grandfather, the footsteps he'd left as a young man working on that ranch. Oh, and another fun fact? The camp host also explained that what remained of the Beartooth Ranch was purchased by a guy you might have heard of, Mel Gibson, in 1988. And the ranch is currently back on the market again. Asking price, $29.6 million. Looked like property might have gone up a tick or two around here in Craig, since that log cabin that Warren and Eliza had built. And the information just kept coming. Later that evening, I walked up the road and across the bridge into town for a visit to Uncle Joe's, the town's watering hole. A couple of years later, I set out on the walk back to the RV park, and upon my return, an elderly gentleman named Bob from just up the road a piece was emptying his trash in the dumpster at the RV park, and he shouted, "How goes it, old-timer?" "Doing well," I answered. We struck up a conversation, albeit from 6 feet apart, dang pandemic. I described my search and recent discoveries, and, well, he didn't recognize or seem familiar with any of the names, beyond Craig, naturally. He recommended that I visit the Cascade Memorial Library, and speak with Jody Campbell and check out a book called Mountains and Meadows. I thanked him and assured him I would. And the very next morning, we made the 21-mile drive up the road to Cascade, and Jody pulled the book I was looking for. As I began to read, she went off in search of something else she thought might help. I opened the book and began to scan. The title read, Mountains and Meadows, a complete history accounting of Craig, Wolf Creek, and Dearborn, Montana. And the table of contents was a list of names. Scanning the list, when I read Warren Craig, I flipped to page 134. I knew from the cemetery that Warren Craig was Nellie Craig's grandfather. At the top of page 134 it read, How the Town of Craig Got Its Name, and History of Warren Craig's Family, by Nellie Craig Johnson. The gravity of what I had just read pressed me back in my seat as if the roller coaster ride had just crested the peak of the rail and plummeted downwards. There, in my great-grandmother's own hand, was nearly everything I wanted to know, and things I didn't even know I wanted to know. And yet, now I did. I couldn't read fast enough. I read it twice. Then I took a picture of it. In a split second, I no longer needed the internet, county records, or any other resource other than the one that I held in my hand. I plied Jody for info on how I might obtain a copy of this book. She said she knew that libraries and some of the historical societies had copies available for checkout, but that she didn't know where I could buy one. In the information age and the wonders of the internet, the power of the written word and a book in my hand was never more important to me. A few moments later, Jody returned with a book called Dearborn County, a history of the Dearborn, Craig, and Wolf Creek areas. Another goldmine of information that went into a great deal more detail of how Warren Craig, my great-great-grandfather, had indeed staked a homestead claim in the area that would later be named for him, all confirming what Grandma Johnson had just got done telling me. It was another incredible afternoon of absorbing, learning, feeling. I felt so full. And while I still had not found that cabin, what I had was so much more. I had knowledge. I had understanding. I now understood that the cabin I had visited as a kid wasn't the original homestead claim that I'd believed it was. It was instead a cabin built as a second home by my great-grandparents. The original family homestead was, now, the entire town of Craig. I spent an entire afternoon in that library, learning of how the arrival of Warren and Eliza and those 7 kids, one of which, a daughter, who would grow up to marry a guy named Spry, have 2 sons of her own, and one of those sons would grow up to marry a German immigrant, Esther Irene, and have their own 3 kids. And one of those 3, the youngest daughter, would become my mom in 1964. But of everything I read, my favorite is how Great-Grandma Nellie ended her writing, just after having moved into the cabin full-time. And I'll quote her. It was a good life, a life I loved, fresh air, spring water, and good friends. I guess I'll probably die here. Close quote. She wrote that at the age of 88. And indeed she did die here in November of 1982 at the age of 94. The next several days were spent exploring everywhere from Lincoln, Wolf Creek, and Cascade to Great Falls and beyond. All the names I now remembered hearing as a child, places my grandparents and their parents would call home for so many years. It's funny how a place that can be considered the middle of nowhere and nothing to one person can be the center of the universe for another person. I don't think I've yet fully wrapped my brain around how Craig, Montana became so big, so important, so quickly in my universe. But yet it did. And it's mind-blowing that it was right here the whole time. So much more than the little cabin I had remembered. I'd also spend hours on that hillside, just below the cemetery, gazing out over Craig, and imagining and picturing 134 years ago, a couple of true pioneers would travel over 1,500 miles before rolling into the valley below me in a covered wagon. They'd stake a claim and a homestead not 4 miles from here. But then they'd cut a deal with another homesteader which essentially made them the owners of what would become the town of Craig. And how he then went about his trade as a blacksmith while moonlighting as the area's first real estate agent, selling off parcels of land to newcomers, and at the same time donating land to the first mercantile in town, and the space carved out for the cemetery on this mountainside, right here where I'm sitting. And how his son John picked up the torch, and in unison with other hard-working locals helped transform Craig into a thriving community becoming known for its production of ice blocks and lumber, thanks to its proximity to that Missouri River and the bounty of the forests to the west. At one point, Montana School District number 26 in Craig, Montana, had 76 students enrolled, indicating that in a time before population and census data was collected in detail, the town was becoming substantial in its own right. But then they'd watch, as so many of the time did, as technology and time took their toll. Frontage roads, wagon trails, and ice boxes gave way to railway, interstates, and fancy plug-in refrigerators. Seemingly, before folks knew it, there was no need for this perfect stop off Midway in the 90-mile stretch between Great Falls and Helena. The commerce that once originated here now passes by within sight, but it doesn't stop. And this is how it would be for so many years here in Craig. Generations moving away, like my grandparents, forced to seek a living and a future somewhere else. But unlike a lot of other small towns across the country, here in Craig, Montana, there would be a second act. As the country entered the 21st century, Craig would start to see a different kind of boom. This Missouri River the town sits next to would become known less for its ice production in the winter and its ability to move lumber in the summer, and more for its bounty of blue-ribbon trout. Avid fly fishermen would come from near and far to learn what the locals always knew. And if fly fishing isn't your game, a guide is happy to drive you 8 miles above the town to Holter Dam and then float the river with you, telling you all about the history of this land. As summer transitions to fall and winter, the fishermen cast aside their fishing poles and vests for earmuffs, a coat, gloves, and a rifle for some of the country's most active waterfowl and game hunting areas. Serious big game hunters? They wait for years to draw a permit to participate in a program that Montana carefully administers. It helps to balance the population of the area's grizzly, moose, mountain lion, and bighorn sheep. There are even some species of big game that can be found nowhere else on the planet, but in this special place in Montana where they're protected. So while the town's year-round population of 43 seems small, then it is. These 43 folks play host to over 40,000 visitors a year, and the number's growing. The future's bright. And thinking through, how am I here today, traveling this journey because folks like William, Nellie, Calvin, Kenneth, Clifford, John, and so many others came before me. They saw something here. They worked hard and cleared a path. Craig, Montana has taught me many things in the past few days. I think above it all, I found the beginning and clarity. And while the name Craig goes back far beyond Montana, deep into the Scottish countryside, where it's said that the family tree branches all the way to Mary Queen of Scots. Perhaps an adventure to decipher another time. But when it comes to the name Craig in America, for me, it's a story about a wounded Union soldier by the name of Warren Craig. He'd find his way with his wife and his family to this place in Montana and call it his own and raise that family. And above all, it's taught me that there's no end, really, is there? Only beginnings. So, here's to beginnings.
Turns out, this thing called life comes with a lot of rules. Maybe it's time to break a few. Because you can. No, seriously. You can.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.